Hey everybody, my name is Bryce. Welcome to Optiv Source ZeroCon. My talk today is, do you know what your API is doing? I'll start with kind of an agenda. This talk is broken down into two components. The first, we'll kind of talk about what an API is, how it's used, why they're important in security assessments, some of the security mechanisms and authentication mechanisms that we see nowadays. And then lastly, we'll go through the API discovery methodology, the approaches that I take when I come across them in various security assessments. And then we'll pivot into the examples of the attacks that I did in 2022. Each one will have three different scenarios. Each one will have a problem, the attack, the impact, and then a mitigation, all with the goal of coming together from an offensive hacker or penetration tester mindset of these things are super complex. We see them often. They're always growing. But really, some of the attacks and some of the vulnerabilities are rather trivial when it comes to how complex web stacks are nowadays. So start with the who am I? Again, like I said, my name is Bryce Hardy. I'm a security consultant too on the attack and pen team here at Optiv. I have a background in software engineering, threat detection, but mostly penetration testing. If you take kind of all these and put them together, I've always been around web applications. So I've always, at some caliber, been playing with them from a security perspective. Which has really drawn my interest into them, kind of web application security in general, and kind of formulated this talk. So what is an API? This is a very loaded question, but an API at its core is a tool that allows applications to communicate with other applications. I won't go into the nitty and gritty. I think at the end of the day, these are very complex, and this talk won't cover every single point of it. It'll kind of just help you understand what it is and how we can kind of leverage that in a security perspective. But APIs can be used for anything, right? They can be used for web applications, mobile applications. There's Windows APIs. There's software as a service APIs. They're everywhere, especially in the IoT field. But at its core value, like I said, it's just allowing for communication from one tool to another. I used to think of them similar to programming language functions, and kind of the concept in my head was a vending machine, right? I enter $1, I get a can of Coke. But I came across this waiter diagram maybe 2 years ago that I think really just helps understand what the API actually does for a little bit of maybe someone that doesn't know what it is or works in the non-technical side. So the API is just like the waiter, right? So you go out to eat. There's a back kitchen. There's people that prep the food. All the food is actually held in the back. And the waiter kind of takes your order. How would you like your food cooked? It communicates with the bill and any things you have. So it's this bridge or this tool between the customer and the chef to bring you what you need, the right thing, the right bill, the right credit card information when you pay, and things like that. So. And an API is, like I said, it's a tool, but at its core too, some of these, for someone with a programming background, they have this CRUD kind of capabilities is what we see a lot. So create, read, update, and delete. And then I have listed at the bottom a little bit types. So there's different types of APIs that are built. Companies can create their own, or people can create their own, but some of the industry standards that we see are like SOAP APIs, REST APIs, GraphQL, and I kind of put these in. Just these top four ones, I think I've seen the most over the past year in 2022. So I put these as kind of some ones, and we'll harp on them later in the scenarios. You'll see the actual implementation of these. So yeah, we'll move on to API security. We're not API developers. I don't develop APIs. I don't expect people to listen to this talk to develop APIs. But security is important when developing these things. Authentication is what we'll kind of start with now. Is almost all of them use some form of authentication. So there's unauthenticated APIs, but there might be functionality on a website or a mobile application that has an authenticated API, and these use anything from an API key. So you see sites like Amazon use this basic authentication. So this is what you'll see like on your router at home. It'll have that when you go to your address, it'll have that little box that comes up. And essentially it just takes the username and the colon, the password, and base64 is it. Bear JWT tokens, those will be a lot in the scenarios, and you'll see those later. These are probably what I've seen the most of over the last year. Microsoft uses them. Many companies use them. And then kind of where the API authentication world is going is OAuth tokens. So there's OAuth 1.0, and then I think there's OAuth 2.0 now. But these can really, that's kind of like what it's evolving into and what you'll see with like single sign-on and things like that. And then again, the next bullet point is authenticated versus unauthenticated. This is key for us to understand when we do security assessments, because as you'll see kind of the iceberg model here, the amount of authorized APIs, there's normally much more than there are unauthenticated. And it'll also change the approach in which we take. So whether we're fuzzing them or looking for vulnerabilities, having insight into where they are and kind of like what functionality they serve will really determine how we approach them. API discovery methodology. This slide I struggle with a little bit because it's kind of a little bit too long of a methodology to be comprehensive. But discovery and enumeration is everything when you approach these. I always say the slow down approach when it comes to web applications, just because for someone that's done web applications, it can be quite overwhelming at first when you go in Burp Suite and you're looking at the requests and the responses and different APIs it calls. So my slow down approach is what I like to do. Is when I first get to an application or an API, is I just open up Flow. It's a Burp Suite attachment. It's an extension. And I just kind of walk through the website just from a normal, just click and point. And I just, pop up on my other monitor, kind of the Burp Suite, the Flow tab, and I just look at the requests to responses. From there, I kind of get an understanding of the lay of the land. I might hide some of the JavaScript junk requests that can really clutter things up. And just seeing kind of, are they GET requests, they post requests, did they call for an options call before them? Are there puts? Things like that, and just getting a lay of the land. So the slow down approach really, instead of all these manually scanners, and just getting an understanding of where you're at, what you're able to access, and kind of some of the requests you see flying across your browser. And then lastly, I put some of the tools I use. These are ones that I've used in the past. I use them on every gig, whether it's Burp Suite or Postman or SecLists, or some of the fuzzer tools I use. These are just a kind of a little list of what I find really useful. All right, now time for scenarios. So like I covered in the agenda, there'll be 3 separate scenarios, each one with kind of a problem and context. I think it's important to always understand the context of what we're assessing, whether it's a web application and kind of like what industry it's in. The technical attacks, there might be a couple screenshots of a Burp Suite or an account or website. And then impact and mitigations for the customer or these vulnerabilities that we identify. So API scenario 1. I put this one just because, and you've probably seen this before if you're in the kind of the web application security world, it's just an information disclosure vulnerability. I see these almost on every assessment. You're going to see them a ton. There's a couple ways to identify them, but you'll see here, in an insurance application, I was able to identify, this is a Burp Suite repeater tab, identify an API that kind of checks if user account email exists or not. So you'll see this user does not exist in the top request. Return kind of a Boolean response, right? False or true. You'll see with an account that I was able to identify that was a valid account or an already existing account and kind of gave back the true. So you'll find these on all types of endpoints, and you'll find them in different ways. You can see them in a Boolean, so a false or true. You can see them with HTTP response sizes. If it returns a certain amount of information, and you can kind of depict that on the size. Or you can I've seen them with timing. Seeing them with timing is kind of a neat feature. You can use a Timinator. It's an attack tool, or it's an attack extension in Burp Suite. If you can find a way that maybe valid usernames take longer or shorter, you can use Timinator to fuzz these valid accounts out. It was actually a popular Outlook web application on-prem vulnerability that we used to be able to use user enumeration and use Timinator to identify valid email accounts. So impacts and mitigation, able to generate like a little over 11,000 customer existing user emails with simple popular high-level domains like Gmail, Yahoo, AOL. It didn't even take a day or so. This is kind of crucial because while it doesn't seem like a huge vulnerability, they didn't have any rate limiting on this. And then an attacker or a more advanced attacker could use this for a huge social engineering gig where they get, tons of valid emails and kind of write a pretty crafted phishing campaign targeting their account for the insurance application. I wanted to note here, this wasn't on the default login page. It wasn't on the forgot password one like you might see on a lot of assessments. This was actually identified quite into the insurance application. So I was able to get a quote, almost you could say, from the insurance application. I was trying to fill out kind of some information during the assessment, and then at the end it had me kind of create the account, and that was the API that was actually not protected. The one on the default login page and the forgot username or forgot password was protected with some CAPTCHA, and it was also protected by a rate limiting. But some of the mitigations, like I just mentioned, that they had implemented on those pages weren't implemented on this endpoint that I identified. So everybody knows the click the circles or click the squares of the bike. How tough that can be sometimes. But that's a valid mitigation for something like this. It helps not identify a ton of valid usernames for no reason that can be used in kind of further attacks and things like that. API scenario 2. So context with this. Again, it's kind of in that healthcare world, a large healthcare application. It's important all these are all black box. I never had a source code review or any source code for these. This is important to mention, and this can definitely change how we take the approach that we talked about methodology, is this website, unlike the last one, had a self-registration portal. So you could actually create an arbitrary account using a random Gmail or a random 10-minute email. And then the EYJ, you'll see that in the authorization. It's a JWT token. So like we talked about those bearer JWTs. Always be on the lookout for that. That EYJ is kind of the start of the JWT token, and you're always going to see it. It's base 64 curly bracket, and then all JWTs start with the word algorithm. So you'll see those first couple characters in the authorization tab. Authorization header will be the start of that algorithm, and then again with the ability to self-register, we're able to get to some of those endpoints that are authenticated. So that's kind of how we changed the approach. We just went ahead and registered, created ourselves an account, and hopped into the application. You'll see here, the first thing I kind of did, like I said, with the slow down approach, is I walked through kind of the requests, and I found this one, manage my account, as a post request, and it was sending my username as the post content. And I was just messing around. Let's put it in repeater, and let's use the first scenario, like we talked about. Found an endpoint like that. Found a couple, 10, 15 valid usernames. Let's send one of their usernames as mine with my authorization header. Let's see what it responds. It sent back a 403. So it's got some type of check or implementation of only allowing to check ourselves. So we tried different couple of check scenarios here. Weren't able to get anything real juicy from this. But it's important to understand kind of how this is communicating, right? It's sending post requests with the username and the contents data. So under that manage my account endpoint, I went through a couple different things. So I tried to reset my email. I tried to reset my password using a different account username, all getting 403. But I had noticed in the self-registration ability portal, I set security questions, and I could actually recover my account using these security questions. So I went ahead and popped open the security questions, reset mine, and I put in one of those usernames that I had found, identified with the information disclosure API, and found that it was giving me a 200 OK. And I was like, well, that's a little weird. I've been seeing 403s all around. So what did I do is I used a valid account, like I said, of somebody else's with my authorization header, put in my answers to my security questions, logged out, went to forgot password, reset password using security questions, used their target account username, filled in the ones that I'd kind of injected, you could say, and got an account takeover. It took me to the set new password. So again, there's a lot going on here. They had everything covered up from 403s, from resetting accounts. It looked like they had all kind of surface level. Everything was using that authenticated header. But unfortunately, the security questions was not. So I was able to kind of take over this account. Here's kind of the flow chart that I put into the report, is kind of working at the top, moving to the right. Identify a target username to take over. So we can do that like with information disclosures, like we talked about in API scenario 1. 2, self-register an account, and reset security questions of the target account that we have. Log out, forget password, reset them using the security questions, update the password of the account. And then the last one I didn't show was to fully really compromise the account, is once I had the valid username and password to the accounts, as I logged into the accounts and reset their emails to an email that I controlled, just so I had full takeover of the account. So impacts and mitigations, again, with context is key, like we talked about with this being a large healthcare application. Taking over account had, of arbitrary accounts that contain PHI, PII, things like that. So when people applied for their healthcare treatment or whatever they apply for, they put in, whether it's insurance or health records and things like that. Another step that I took in the account is I fuzzed for accounts that were kind of admin rolled, just because they might have some admin functionality that I also didn't put in here. So I was able to find kind of like a site admin or a root admin account, take that account over, and they had some advanced functionality that actually led to remote code execution on the web server itself. Again, it's important here too. You'll see on the right is at each step of these, I did get an email to the account that was being taken over, that they had changed their questions, and then that they had also changed their passwords. So that's a little bit of a mitigation that users might see this and raise an alert or call right away like they put in. But mitigations, you'll hear about this later too, is use authentication on every endpoint. This is so important. They had everything covered except for this one, and this one essentially led to remote code execution and account takeover, full account takeovers on whatever account that I could identify. And then also don't allow security questions to reset from the password form. Why not just send the reset link to the account email, like you see with all the applications online? This is important to note here because, well, sometimes we do see weak security questions like favorite color or birth year or things like that. These were actually pretty good questions to have, and they just let them reset right through the portal. So definitely a mitigation they could have put into place that would have stopped this attack vector. So API scenario number 3. This is probably the coolest one, or the one that the one I think is the most complex. So again, context, very large penetration test for a very large company. During kind of the OSINT and profiling phase, I found a subdomain portal for communicating with buyers. So they sell a product, the buyers buy the product. They use this to for kind of support right to the developers that develop the product. It's kind of a technology-based product. And then the last one is, like we talked about, authorization versus authentication. So it's very important to understand that the authentication is the process of verifying who the user is, so logging them in and username, password, and things like that. And then authorization is actually the process of what privileges do they have? What do they have access to? And you'll see that, like we talked about in the last scenario, we kind of moved from, an authorization side. So we moved from user A to user B. You'll see this kind of like a vertical privilege escalation. So we'll try to move from a user to like an admin user. So API maturity and identification. As you can see here on the left, they had a developer portal. During my kind of approach, I saw that they were calling a developer-API. They weren't using usernames. They were using these little strings here, and you might recognize those. And then they were using, again, the bearer token, and you'll see in that burp request it says EYJ. That's a JWT, a first tail sign added. So you'll see also in the response that it goes right to the developer portal, and it returns. This is just it returns my information. So with this one, it was a little bit different because it did have the self-registration capability, but it was using Microsoft 365. And with an assessment like this for that authentication mechanism, we're not going to target Microsoft 365 because we have trust that it's pretty secure and it doesn't have some of these little bit more trivial vulnerabilities. So with this assessment, I can enroll my Gmail account that I use to test with M365, and it would authorize me to have an account on this portal. So they didn't actually handle the authentication, they handled the authorization like we talked about. So discovery is key. We talked about that in the approach as well. I was able to fuzz out some of the documentation from their API. So they have, as you notice here, if anybody's familiar with documentation of APIs, Swagger is like the go-to standard with REST APIs. So able to find a pretty large Swagger documentation of all the APIs that they had listed. This could be pretty overwhelming. This is it was over 20,000 lines. This is when you use some of those tools that I talked about, like Postman. So you'll see on the right here, this is Postman. And I'm able to just throw in the URL or the TXT file or the JSON file right into this thing, and it'll actually go out and reach it and kind of map it out for you. It'll show you all the routes, all the endpoints, what they expect if they're post requests, what they expect at their get requests, what's the information that they return, and things like that. You can use Postman, Swagger UI, SOAP UI, Hopscotch. These are all mostly open source. And then again, let's modify our approach, right? We've got this overwhelming amount of APIs. We're a basic user. We enrolled using Microsoft. Let's not look to move to horizontal accounts. Let's look for more admin functionality. I put this in here because a lot of times clients will block their API documentation from us. It might help, it might not. It depends on if it's open source, but it definitely can still have bugs if there's well documented, like you'll see here. Not in this one, in this case. So kind of one of the approaches I did is I started looking into some of the like authenticated applications. So I was able to identify, the 10,000 lines of documentation of the authenticated stuff. A lot of different CRUD capabilities. Let's just control F for admin, find all for admin. Walking through some of the admin APIs, I came across this one. /user and then /username lifecycle make CMS admin. So in my head and in some of like the profiling fingerprinting I did, CMS is content management system, and I identified that this portal was using Drupal as their content management system. So I was like, ooh, that's kind of juicy. Let me see what I can do. So I, hundreds and hundreds of burp requests later, I crafted my own Gmail account, make CMS admin. The /n parameter that you'll see in the request data you'll see down below, it's /admin. This thing was finicky. It took me a couple hours to figure out. I didn't know what the groups were, and I actually had to fuzz out some of these groups until I got the right code response. But it'll show you here on the side if it's 200, it's okay, or 201 created, or I wasn't getting forbidden. I was getting 404 for the /n. So I'm like, so it's not denying me, but it's not giving me it. So I threw it into intruder with kind of a larger list, and I finally got it a 200 okay. Didn't instantly get it. I logged in, I logged out, came back, and I was a Drupal admin, as you'll see, kind of highlighted up top. I had all the capabilities to basically do whatever I wanted. And then you'll see in the roles as I admitted some of these because they're a little bit proprietary to the company. But, I was able to check, there were 15 roles. Since I was CMS admin, I was just to add myself to all those groups, log in, log back out, and I had basically every role that was possible within the application. So impact and mitigation, full takeover of the site itself, I guess you could say, customer accounts, services, pricing, some of their Amazon API keys, and ultimately led to remote code execution through some Drupal magic. Mitigations, like we talked about in API scenario 2, authentication on all the APIs. And I know it sounds repetitive, but they had tons of mitigating factors. Everything I tried had been 403 up until this point, or using authentication in the right manner. And I was able just to kind of stumble up on this one. And then understanding risks with your own APIs or rolling your own, right? So there's a little bit different if we go back to the Swagger documentation is, this didn't have the same naming conventions as the other API. So it had like camel casing on this one, which I thought was interesting. And then later during the assessment, they said that they had created this API on their own. So, their entire library, they were using a source library, a tested library, and they had kind of written a couple of these that were a little bit less tested from a security perspective. So you have to understand your risks of doing that. And key takeaways from the whole talk from all three scenarios is, ensure all endpoints are protected and tested, whether it's developer or admin authenticated methods or testing. It's always important to test these things before they go into production. Things aren't as complex as they seem, and that's the goal of this talk, right? Is to, Burp Suite and web technology stacks and security mechanisms and cookies and headers, they're all so complex. And you would think in 2022 some of these attacks wouldn't be here, but they still are, and they're still pretty prevalent. Assumptions are kind of the mother of all mistakes, like I kind of mentioned earlier in attack scenario 3. With the path is, I didn't think it would work. It wasn't when it would say 200 okay, I wouldn't be Drupal admin, and I had to log in, log out, and eventually making the assumption of okay, well, let's check for different paths. I was able to kind of get Drupal admin. API monitoring detection awareness. Just like a use case that someone might have on an internal network, like, hey, let's make sure to alert when someone's added to, the domain, the like domain admins group. Why not do that for some of the API monitoring? You can easily pipe in some of the requests to certain APIs into a logging in your SIEM or your event monitoring system and detect for this. And then SDLC, we never really got into that deeply, but all this stuff kind of hits on bullet point. One is just make sure these things are tested and they go through the right pipeline. They're not just written on the last step of the pipeline by a couple developers to make things easier for themselves or for the API in general. That's it. Any questions? Thanks for coming to the talk.